In 1971, Richard Nixon picked up the phone and called the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns. He asked him, politely at first, then persistently, to soften monetary policy ahead of the elections. Burns complied. The result was a decade of stagflation that scarred an entire generation of Americans. Mortgage rates climbed, savings evaporated. The purchasing power of working families was quietly hollowed out. Not through a single dramatic decision, but through the steady erosion of an institutional norm. Today is April 21st, 2026, and history is not repeating itself exactly, but it is rhyming with uncomfortable precision. In a Senate Banking Committee hearing room in Washington, Kevin Worsh, Donald Trump's nominee to lead the Federal Reserve, sat before a panel of senators who asked him, in various ways, the same fundamental question: can you be trusted to be independent? And Warsh answered. He said, quote, "I'm honored the president nominated me for the position, and I'll be an independent actor if confirmed as chairman of the Federal Reserve." He said, quote, "Monetary policy independence is essential." The headlines moved on quickly after that. But let's not move on. Because the question worth asking, the question almost no one is asking, is not what Kevin Worsh said in that room today. The question is, what will he do 18 months from now, when the phone rings? Let me give you the structure beneath the surface of this story, because this is not simply about one man's confirmation hearing. This is about a methodical, multi-year campaign to reshape the most powerful financial institution in the world, and about what that means for the global order. Let's start with the immediate facts. Kevin Worsh testified before the Senate Banking Committee in a high-stakes confirmation hearing as President Donald Trump's nominee to lead the U.S. Central Bank. He told lawmakers he wants to overhaul many parts of the Federal Reserve as we've come to know it over the past few decades. Warsh vowed to introduce what he called regime change at the Federal Reserve if confirmed, potentially reducing the number of policy meetings per year and suggesting a new framework for inflation. Now let's slow down on that word, regime change. That is a striking phrase to use about a central bank. Not a reform, not an adjustment, a regime change. Keep that in mind. Warsh said he would absolutely not be Trump's sock puppet, a term Senator Elizabeth Warren derisively used several times in the hearing. Warren twice referred to Warsh with the demeaning term during her opening remarks at his confirmation hearing before the Senate Banking Committee. Warren criticized Warsh's recent stance on inflation and interest rates, saying that his views seemed tailored to win Trump's approval. Here is the detail that deserves more attention. Warsh previously served on the Fed's Board of Governors and had a reputation as hawkish, meaning he was cautious about cutting interest rates for fear inflation might get out of control. But in recent months, Warsh voiced support for lower interest rates, rebuking the Fed's concern about inflation risk posed by a flurry of new tariffs issued last year. His views shifted, and they shifted in alignment with the preferences of the man who would nominate him. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And that pattern doesn't start or end with Kevin Worsh. Let's look at the broader architecture of what has been happening to the Federal Reserve. Attacks on the Fed have accelerated in Trump's second administration. In April 2025, Trump lashed out at Powell in an online post, suggesting that the central banker's termination cannot come fast enough. And in August, Trump took the unprecedented step of firing Fed Governor Lisa Cook, which a court later blocked. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation into Fed Chair Jerome Powell in January, alleging that Powell lied to Congress about cost overruns in renovations to the Fed's headquarters. Powell responded in a video statement, alleging that the investigation marked a new facet in the Trump administration's pressure campaign to get the Fed to lower interest rates. A federal judge agreed with Powell, blasting the investigation as an unjustified act of intimidation. This is not a mistake. This is a symptom. What we are watching is not a chaotic administration stumbling into conflict with its own central bank. What we are watching is a deliberate, step-by-step operation to test the limits of institutional independence, to find out exactly how far you can push before the system pushes back. And the system, so far, has pushed back. The courts have blocked some moves. Trump appointee Brett Kavanaugh said Trump's stance would weaken, if not shatter, the independence of the Federal Reserve. But legal victories in the short term do not guarantee institutional health in the long term. Institutions are not just laws. They are also norms, and norms can be rewritten without a single statute being changed. Let's zoom out now to the economic level, to what this means for real people. When it comes to what Americans can afford, no institution looms larger than the Federal Reserve. The nation's central bank doesn't set the price of groceries, cars, or homes directly, but it does influence how expensive it is to borrow money. and that can make a significant difference in what families pay each month. Right now, borrowing is costly. High interest rates mean larger monthly payments on mortgages, car loans, and credit cards, even if the price of a home or vehicle hasn't changed. Trump wants rates cut. He wants them cut now, and he has been explicit about it. In December, Trump laid out what he called the Trump rule on Truth Social. "I want my new Fed chairman to lower interest rates if the market is doing well," the president wrote. He concluded that anybody that disagrees with me will never be the Fed chairman. But here is the structural paradox that is almost never discussed in mainstream coverage. Even if Warsh wants to lower interest rates, he may not be able to. Interest rates are set by a 12-member committee at the Fed, and many committee members are reluctant to cut rates until inflation is closer to the central bank's 2% target. The war with Iran and the resulting spike in gasoline prices have made that a more challenging goal. The issue of Fed independence has grown more pressing in recent weeks as the Iran war has driven U.S. energy prices higher, pushing inflation to its fastest pace in almost 2 years. In other words, even if you place a politically sympathetic chairman at the head of the Fed, the structural machinery of the institution can resist. The committee votes. Dissenting voices are recorded. Markets watch dissent as a signal of internal fracture. And a fractured Fed is a weakened Fed, regardless of who sits in the chair. Now let's zoom out further to the geopolitical level, because this story is not contained within the borders of the United States. What happens to the Federal Reserve's credibility is felt across every sovereign wealth fund, every central bank, every bond market on the planet. The Federal Reserve is facing pressure on multiple fronts, including a Justice Department criminal probe involving Chair Jerome Powell, a Supreme Court case weighing limits on the Fed's independence, and persistent cost of living concerns testing Trump's economic agenda. These are not isolated events. They are simultaneous pressure points on a single load-bearing institution of the post-war financial order. Think about it this way. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is not simply a product of American economic size. It is a product of trust. Trust in the predictability, the stability, and the insulation from political whim of American monetary institutions. When that trust is questioned, it does not disappear overnight, but it leaks, slowly, persistently. And the entities watching that leak most carefully are in Beijing, in Moscow, in Riyadh. For China, every moment of doubt about American institutional reliability is a strategic gift. Beijing has spent years building alternative financial architecture, expanding the use of the yuan in bilateral trade, deepening BRICS financial mechanisms, promoting cross-border payment systems that bypass the dollar. They do not need to defeat the dollar in a direct confrontation. They simply need doubt to accumulate until alternatives become more attractive. A politicized Federal Reserve accelerates that process without China needing to do anything at all. For Russia, the narrative value alone is enormous. Every attack on Powell, every criminal investigation of a sitting Fed chair, every threat from a sitting president to fire the leader of his own central bank, these are propaganda assets of immense value. The argument that Western institutions are no more independent than their counterparts in authoritarian states becomes easier to make when Western leaders are openly trying to control those institutions. And for the global South, for India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, the normalization of political interference in monetary policy is a kind of ideological permission slip. If the United States does it, the argument that independent central banking is a universal norm, a prerequisite for development and stability, becomes much harder to sustain. Let's come back to the hearing room. Warsh's opening remarks made it clear that he will try to walk a tightrope. He needs to appeal to lawmakers who argue that the Fed must be insulated from political pressure while also appeasing President Trump, who has repeatedly called for lower interest rates. That tightrope is real, and it is structurally unstable, because the man who put him on it publicly declared, in writing, that anyone who disagrees with him will never be Fed chairman. The selection criterion was not competence, it was compatibility. Central banks remain part of the government bureaucracy, and independence granted to them can always be reversed, either by changing laws or backtracking on established practices. This is the quiet truth that rarely makes the front page. Independence is not an absolute. It is a practice. It is a daily renewal of a norm. And when the people chosen to uphold that norm are selected precisely because they are unlikely to challenge the person who chose them, the norm begins to dissolve, quietly, without a single law being broken. There is one more layer to this story that I want to draw your attention to. While Warsh is widely expected to be confirmed to succeed Powell, whose term expires on May 15th, One potential roadblock is Senator Tom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina, who previously said he wouldn't approve the nomination until the Department of Justice concludes an investigation into Powell. It's unclear who will run the central bank if the Senate is unable to confirm Warsh by next month. That ambiguity, that leadership vacuum at the world's most important central bank, is itself a message sent to global markets. It says, the institution is contested, its future is uncertain. And that uncertainty, for investors, for sovereign funds, for foreign governments holding trillions in U.S. treasuries, is a cost, a real, compounding, structural cost. Firing Powell would raise significant legal questions and would not take place immediately. Although Trump can legally fire Fed officials, he can do so only for cause, according to Section 10 of the Federal Reserve Act. The Supreme Court case on Lisa Cook will likely define exactly what that means, and its ruling will shape the legal landscape of central bank independence for decades to come. So here is where we are. We have a nominee who says all the right things in a Senate hearing room. We have a president who has laid out explicitly and publicly that anyone who disagrees with him will not lead the Fed. We have a criminal investigation being used as institutional leverage. We have a Supreme Court case that will redefine the boundary between executive power and central bank independence. We have a global audience watching each of these developments and recalibrating their assessment of American institutional reliability. And we have history, offering us its usual uncomfortable testimony. The 1970s told us what happens when monetary policy becomes an instrument of electoral convenience. The answer was a decade of pain, for families, for businesses, for the credibility of the institutions themselves. The recovery required Paul Volcker, a chairman willing to endure enormous political hostility to restore price stability. It required years of rebuilding trust. Trust, once spent, is not easily replenished. I want to leave you with one question, not a rhetorical flourish, but a genuinely open structural question that I think will define the next decade of American economic governance. Can an institution maintain its independence when the primary criterion for leading that institution has shifted from demonstrated independence to demonstrated loyalty? And if it cannot, what does that mean? Not just for interest rates, not just for inflation, but for the architecture of a global financial order that was built over 70 years on the assumption that some institutions stand above the political cycle. That is not a question about Kevin Worsh. It is a question about what comes after him, and after the one who comes after him. The answer to that question will be written not in Senate hearings, but in the decisions made in quiet moments, under political pressure, when no cameras are rolling, and when the phone rings.